Hello all, and thank you for clicking on the Just Love in Person Sunday message. One of the most important aspects of Black History Month is that it compels us to remember the past. And indeed, that's the reason that Carter G. Woodson started it. Certainly, we celebrate those who are contemporary success stories, and we encourage those who will be leading the future. But we do so under the auspices of remembering the past. Remembering the triumphs and the trials of old, bringing to memory things that had been forgotten, things that had been all but swept away from history, things that people ought to know but would not know without the concerted effort to remember. As has been said many times, remembering where you've been will allow you to know where you're going. If you can't look back and see the path you've been on, then you won't be able to discern from the many paths in front of you which is the correct continuous path. And then obviously that feeds into the other cliche. If you don't remember your history, you'll be doomed to repeat it. If you don't remember the path, then there is a high likelihood that you'll take a new one that leads you back in the direction from which you have come. And of course, we don't need to guess if any of this is actually true, because we're living it right now in America, with the reemergence of overt racism and white supremacy, with the demagoguery, groupthink, mob violence, murderous mentalities, and tribalism that dominated the first 2/3 of the 20th century, when bodies swung from southern trees, when law enforcement militarized against certain citizens, and when leaders were met with the assassin's bullet. Not remembering the devastation we've come out of is in real time having devastating consequences. For instance, if you're someone who sees the Confederate flag as honorable or a source of heritage, it's because you do not remember, either willfully or by miseducation, what the Confederate flag represents. The Confederates were slave mongers who rebelled against and went to war with their own country in an attempt to retain Africans as slaves. And they started that war by attacking the U.S. military. The same U.S. military that most Confederate flag wavers claim to support and celebrate, the Confederacy attacked at Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. The Confederates were traitorous, anarchist, violent, white supremacist, human rights violators. And those of them who were not slaveholders or were not dogged about maintaining slavery, as has been said of Robert E. Lee, were nonetheless willing to participate in a violent insurrection against their nation in support of the institution of slavery. That's how strongly they disregarded humanity. There is no godliness to be found in the Confederacy. There is no honor in the heritage. Now, that's not to say that if you descend from that or were raised in that you have no godliness or honor, because what we do determines our honor, not where we come from. And a person who abides in holiness and justice is honorable regardless of his or her heritage. But there is no honor in the heritage of the Confederacy. And the failure to remember that over the course of time has led to a point where white supremacists and individuals who share in their political tribalism would attempt a violent insurrection against the United States. An action on January 6, 2021 that resulted in the death of 3 Capitol police officers, injuries to hundreds of police officers, and the parading of the Confederate flag through the halls of U.S. Congress for the first time ever. To make that point more succinctly, failing to remember what the Confederacy really was caused those who claimed it as their heritage to repeat its violent, illegal, immoral acts. When you don't remember where you come from and what you come out of, you can't determine where you ought to go, and you will undoubtedly head in the wrong direction. For this reason, the word remember is used a great deal in the Bible. We can all recall from our participation in communion that when Jesus instituted that ritual during the Last Supper, he said, "This do in remembrance of me. Remember my body which was broken and my blood which was shed. Remember the suffering I endured for your sins, so that you don't be deceived into thinking sin is no big deal." Remember. In early Bible history, when God brought the children of Israel out of slavery in Egypt, it was emphasized repeatedly that they should always remember where they come from and what they came out of. Exodus 13:3. And Moses said to the people, "Remember this day in which you went out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. For by strength of hand the Lord brought you out of this place." That statement was made as Moses was instituting the Passover, which itself was celebrated for the purpose of remembering all that God did to give Israel its freedom. Remember. In the book of Deuteronomy, that word remember is used 14 times. For the most part, the usages are some variation of what we see in chapter 5, verse 15. And remember that you are a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you, keep the Sabbath day. They were told to remember what God had brought them through. And as was the case with the Passover, the Sabbath was instituted to be a day of remembrance. Remember. Interestingly, one of those 14 remember verses in Deuteronomy is Moses talking to God. Chapter 9, verse 27, Moses told God, "Remember your servants, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Do not look on the stubbornness of this people or on the wickedness of their sin." Not that God needed to be reminded or needed to be convinced of anything, but Moses had learned from God how important it was to remember. And so in this instance, Moses, knowing that the people were stiff-necked and deserving of God's wrath, pleaded for mercy, saying, "Lord, remember the promise you made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Remember. The last of those 14 remember verses occurs in Deuteronomy 32:7. And it says, "Remember the days of old. Consider the years of many generations. Ask your father and he will show you, your elders and they will tell you." And that's where I want to focus for a few minutes. Remembering the days of old. Considering the years of the many generations that have gone by. And receiving knowledge about those bygone years from our elders. Because that is the point of Black History Month. To tell the great multitude of stories about the triumphs and trials throughout the many generations. Just as was the case with those words in Deuteronomy 32:7, Black History Month exists to remind its audience of where they have come from and where they must go. The reason we talk about Mary McLeod Bethune and her education initiatives is to remind people that education is precious and necessary. The reason we speak about W.E.B. Du Bois and the NAACP is to remind people to be active in the quest for progress. The reason we speak about Rosa Parks and that bus seat is to remind people that nothing is gained without the willingness to sacrifice. The reason we speak about Nelson Mandela and his conquering of apartheid is to remind people that we are connected and we overcome together. The reason we speak about Garrett A. Morgan and his inventions is to remind people that black ingenuity makes the world go round. Therefore, the path that we must all be on is one that leads to knowledge, action, sacrifice, unity, and creativity. When we remember where we have come from, we will know where we ought to be going. Remember. But just like we remember individuals of national and international renown, we must also remember local individuals. We must remember the people from right here in Person County who educated, acted, sacrificed, triumphed, and created. We must remember the pioneers, the people who broke color barriers. We must remember the educators who taught out of raggedy books or no books at all in rundown schoolhouses. We must remember the old deacons who drove all the neighborhood kids to Sunday school. We must remember the civil rights activists who put themselves in harm's way. We must remember the older women who provided love and guidance to all the children in the community. We must remember the doctor and the dentist who committed themselves to an impoverished and underserved group of people. We must remember the preachers and the gospel singers. We must remember the farmers, the mechanics, and the mill workers. There are so many people from Person County whose contributions must be remembered, whose triumphs and trials we must all know in order to move in the right direction. Do we remember? Do we remember all of these people and their stories? Do we remember the days of old? Have we considered the years of many generations past? And those stories that we do remember, are we telling them? Are each one of us passing on the stories from our lives and our experiences? Are we telling younger generations about all the older people in the family who raised us? The older people in the community who watched over us? The older church folk who nurtured us? Are we telling our children about the coaches who mentored us and the teachers who pushed us? Are we telling the stories of the people who left and went to college, got an education, and could have gone anywhere in the world, but came back to Person County with their knowledge and expertise? Are we telling the stories of the individuals who came to Person County from other places and became part of the fabric of this community because of their willingness to help and serve others? All these people who went where they felt the Lord was sending them and did what they felt God would have them do. And in so doing, they laid the groundwork for progress. Do we remember them? And are we telling their stories? Because if these stories aren't told, if the history isn't made known, how will we know which direction we ought to be headed in? How can we progress? My fear is that we are forgetting, that we have been in a state of ongoing forgetfulness, where we don't pass on to the younger generation all that we received, where we pick and choose what's worth keeping and toss the rest aside, where we express contempt for people of the past for perceived flaws without acknowledging that we benefit from their work and sacrifice every day. We're individuals who put their lives on the line for our betterment now exist in the realm of out of sight, out of mind. And because we are in this forgetful state, we struggle to build on the knowledge, wisdom, creativity, courage, and morality that make up our foundation. Case in point, if there was a conversation of concern within the community in the 1970s, 80s, or 90s, it should not still be an issue in 2021. If something was lacking in our community 2 or more decades ago, it should not still be lacking. And if it is, then that means we are struggling to build on the incredible foundation that we have. But if we would remember all that came before us, if we made the effort to remember all the stories, all the individuals, all the triumphs and the trials, then we could muster up the strength to build. And we could build up a community that sets an example for the whole state, sets an example for the whole country on togetherness, fairness, empathy, encouragement, integrity, achievement, advancement. If we remember and tell those stories of triumph and trial, then we can see clearly the direction we ought to go in. And we can get Person County where it needs to go. And Person County can lead other communities the right way. It's not hard. It's not as hard as you might think. If it was, then Deuteronomy 32:7 wouldn't be saying to do it. We must remember. Remember. The ancestors deserve for us to remember. The future requires for us to remember. And Person County desperately needs us to remember. Remember the days of old. Consider the years of many generations. Ask your father and he will show you, your elders and they will tell you. By the way, that verse is part of Moses' last set of statements to Israel before he died, as they were finally set to enter into the promised land. The promised land for Person County is close. It's right around the corner. But in order to get there, we have to remember. Amen.